Alright, so hello one and all, welcome back to another Mushoku Tensei video where I'll be going over the manga and light novel to discuss everything that the anime covered and everything that the anime skipped. With no waiting, let's just get straight to it. So we start off with the story as to why Geese won't teach Eris to cook, but I already went into that when covering the light novel last episode. So TLDR, Geese taught Zenith how to cook for Paul and then they left Fangs of the Black Wolf. And then they disbanded and that left Geese all on his own. He also says that the man, which we know is Paul now, wasn't happy because of the relationship. And hearing about that got Eris depressed. Because more so in the manga and light novel, she has a bit of a complex and wants to be there for Rudius but doesn't really know how. And so this kind of just hurts her even more. We then cut to Rudius just hard focusing on Eris's tits while they're in the carriage. Rudius then asks what kind of breasts Geese likes. There's a lot of S's in there. And so he says that he loves them big, and he especially loves the Rikurisu Town's guild receptionist who had 3 breasts. You guys remember her? She's great. I can't put my finger on why I like her so much. But Geese tells Rudius to make sure that Eris stays happy and asks how they met, prompting Rudius to go into the story of what happened since the teleportation incident. Rudius says that he's doing all of this just to see her home, but then starts to question if he made the right choices along the way. And just then, Geese pats Rudius on the back and tells him that he did his best. And with this kind of being the first, affirmation of gratitude, aside from Eris anyway, Rudius starts to break down and cry, saying that he's worked so hard to get here, all just to bring Eris home safely. And Rudius says that he can't wait to see Paul and Zenith and hopes that they'll greet him in the same way that Geese is comforting him now. Oof. But hooray, they finally made it to Militian, and apparently the obelisks I mentioned before, they're actually magical towers. And they actually control the weather, making it like the perfect weather year-round. But the White Palace floats in the Grand Lake in the center of town, and Militian is said to be the most beautiful city in the world. And now in Militian, Geese parts ways with Dead End as he gives Rudius, I think, it's Eris's panties as a parting gift, and he then tells him to visit the Adventurers Guild. But Geese then pats Rudius on the head as he leaves them, and as Eris and Ruijerd go find an inn, Rudius goes to the guild to find some people fighting and then uses Quagmire to put them in a stop. And just then, someone comes up to Rudius and tells him to back off and to not harm his men. And for some reason, Rudius doesn't want them to see his face, and so he puts the panties on as a mask. And just as the man slices off the panties from Rudius' face, he finds out that it's Paul. Rudius thinks back to his time in Buena Village and compares the former Paul to the one standing in front of him now. He almost reminds him of his father from the previous world. And he thought back about how Geese was so appreciative of Rudius' struggles and proud of what he had done, and how he patted him on the back saying that he did his best. Paul, however, pats Rudius on the shoulder, and he says that he did well to survive. And then he kind of just took back his hand. And so from there, the argument kind of goes the same as how it does in the anime, and there's minor differences, but it's not really worth mentioning. However, we do find out the names of the 2 girls. The busty, provocative, one, is Vieira, and her sister, the mage, is Shera. And I really do love the visuals of this fight though. As Rudius punches Paul, he's also shattering an image of what he thought the reunion would look like. And he thinks, my food was bad, I could barely sleep, I made a lot of mistakes, I had enough just dealing with my problems, I never had a moment to think of other victims who had been transported. Uncertain, insecure, afraid, and through it all, vowing to protect Eris. And as he says and thinks this, he once again pictures Geese telling him that he did his best in comparison to Paul telling him that he could have done better. And from there, Norn pushes Rudius and calls him a bully, as Paul explains that he's the leader of the Fidoa region search party, and that everyone he sees in the guild, including Vieira and Shera, are all victims of the teleportation incident. After asking Rudy to speak up, he looks at Paul with I don't even know how to describe it, but with a broken face, I guess. And then he runs off. And he runs past Geese, who thinks to himself that Paul and Rudius should have had their touching reunion by now. So what happened? But then, waiting by some docks, Ruijerd and Eris find Rudius as he tells them what happened. Eris gets mad and calls Paul a failure, and Ruijerd leaves him and Eris alone as she quickly wraps her arms around him and tells him that everything will be fine and that she'll be there for him. So yeah, not too many differences. I mean, the initial fight with Paul, what started the fight to begin with, was definitely different, right? He didn't see any kidnapping, he just did what Geese told him to do. But I do think that the manga kind of just visualized everything better, right? It really, like, we know that Rudius is in pain already in the anime, but this just I, insert expression here. It really just makes him feel like shit even more, and it's so good. But anyway, let's move on to the light novel. Because this is the start of a new volume, we kind of get a reintroduction to like everything. And Rudius says that it's been 18 months since the Fedoa teleportation incident, meaning that we should be around October of K419, if I have Rudius's birthday correct. And it makes sense as well because it's been stated that Eris just recently turned 14, so I think she has maybe a late birthday, which seems to be true. But we also get an excerpt from Wandering the World by the adventurer Bloody Kant. And I love their name. So I will read it to you right now. Millis is the capital of the holy country of Millis. Approaching it from the Holy Sword Highway offers travelers a spectacular view of the city in its entirety. First, your eyes will be drawn to the Grand Lake, a brilliant blue body of water fed by the Nicholas River, which flows down from the Blue Worm Mountains. At the lake's very center, the Great White Palace seems to float above its waters. Further down the banks of Nicholas, you'll spot two other distinctive landmarks: the city's radiant golden cathedral and the shining silver headquarters of the Adventurers Guild. The city that surrounds these remarkable buildings is laid out as neatly as the squares on a sheet of grid paper. At its outer edges, you'll notice 7 imposing towers, with vast green plains stretching out beyond them. This is a place not only rich in majesty, but also in perfect harmony with nature. No other city in the world is nearly as beautiful. And so Rudius questions how the White Palace doesn't suffer from the rainy season, and Geese says that there are 7 magic towers that protect the city from harsh weathers and other harm, since the towers generate magic barriers. So if you wanted to capture the city, you'd have to take down the 7 towers first. Kind of like Minecraft's Ender Dragon, I guess. But Geese tells Rudius to not even joke about it, since the Holy Knights would toss you in jail just for talking about it. So I'm kind of just going to read through how the city is described, how the layout is, because there's no point in rewording it. To the north was the residential district, where most of the blocks were lined with family homes. There were some differences between the areas where common folk lived and where the families of nobles and knights resided, but virtually every building in this district was a house of some sort. To the east, you had the commercial district, where most of the city's major businesses were located. You could find some retail shops here, but they tended to be small-scale operations. The district was mostly dominated by larger companies. This was where you can find militians, blacksmiths, and auction houses. To the south was the Adventurers District, with the guild headquarters at its center. It was full of inns, bars, and shops catering to professional fortune seekers. It also had quite a few gambling halls and slums where failed adventurers lived, though you had to watch yourself. And for whatever reason, the city's slave market was located here instead of in the commercial district. And now finally, to the west was the Divine District, home of many of the Millis Church's ranking members. You could find the city's enormous cathedral here as well as a spacious graveyard. The Holy Knights of Millis were also headquartered here. And so circling around the city to the Adventurers District, because outsiders who enter through other districts are often subjugated to lengthy inspection, they made their way to a nearby stable to sell their horse. And that is when Geese finally departs from the gang and tells them to go to the Adventurers Guild. And after that, Dead End search for an inn, which most of them are kind of away from any main venue, so they ended up wandering for a little bit, but they settled on a place called the Dawn's Light Inn. And it wasn't too far away from the main streets, but it was attracted to C to B rank adventurers and was quite good quality compared to anything else that they've slept in. And so after their routine of cleaning their weapons, among other things, putting away clothing, whatever, Rudius calls a team meeting. He says that he wants them to stay in this town for about a month, as opposed to their usual 1 week then head off to the next town kind of strat. And this is to earn up a lot of money. He also wanted a day off the next day, which isn't really new. He used to call them for Eris, but she soon began to have endless supply of stamina, and Ruijerd was obviously good. So for the most part, he mostly called these days off for him. And it's not like he's out of shape or anything, so it's not the physical exhaustion that gets him, it's more so the mental exhaustion. Rudius still isn't used to killing living things, and so it takes a toll on his mental state. but that wasn't why he called tomorrow's day off, and it was rather to send a letter back to Fidoa. And meanwhile, Eris says that she wants to kill a bunch of goblins, and after a little bit of convincing, Rudius is like, okay, well, don't get careless just because they're weak. And Eris goes, yep, I know. And make sure you're well prepared before you go. Of course. And if things get dicey, just turn tail and run. Right. And if worse comes to worse, just grab the little goblin by the hand and yell, this goblin's a molester, at the top of your... Enough, I get it, all right, okay, I get it. And so Eris is a little fed up with that, and this is not the last time that Rudius will do something like this. It's very funny. He's quite the overcautious person. But then when Rudius asks what Ruger is going to do, he says something just shocking. Ruger is going to visit one of his friends. Yeah, Ruger has friends apparently, and it's kind of a big part that the anime skips out, I'm not gonna lie, and I don't know why. It's such a weird plot point to skip out, because it leads to something so much more, but we'll get to that in a couple episodes when the event happens, or it might even be next episode, it doesn't matter. We'll see it eventually. And so as Rudius takes a stroll around the city to get a feel for the area, he starts thinking about Millis' food. Despite the quality of food here being much better, the price is far cheaper than compared to the Demon Continent. And on top of that, Millis is known for its chicken and eggs. And the Demon Continent does sell eggs, but they're far more expensive, and they're primarily used to hatch like a baby bird monster that you can have as a pet. You don't eat them. And so while Millis itself does have edible eggs, it doesn't have rice or soy sauce. Meanwhile, the northern and eastern parts of the central continent consider rice to be a staple food. And however, despite this world having both rice and eggs, it does not, unfortunately, have soy sauce. And although soybeans do seem to exist thanks to Rudius' plant dictionary, that gift from Zenith has come in like so many times now. It's one of those gifts that you go like, oh, thanks mom, that's great. But it saved him a lot. But because of this, soybeans most likely do exist, that they appear to anyway, but nobody's fermented them yet and made them into a sauce yet. And so as he thinks about all this, he decides to return to the inn through an alleyway. And as Rudius does, he sees a group of 5 or so delinquents running down the alley, pushing past him with someone stuffed in a duffel bag. Obviously, since Dead End stands on the side of justice, despite Rudius' recent problems of stopping kidnappings, he decides that he can't let his past issues stop him from saving someone in need. Rudius then follows the goons as they lead him to some kind of warehouse next to a bar that's closed in by a bunch of tight alleyways. He then uses his earth magic to lift himself up and climb through the window, unlike in the anime where he was just able to disintegrate the wall, because again, the anime makes Rudius so much more OP, for whatever reason. But the fight between the goons and Rudius goes pretty similarly, however his fight with Viera and Shara went on a bit longer. Being distracted by Viera's breasts, he tries to come up with a plan to cover them up, and he uses Icicle Field, a spell that covers the area around him with ice, and he uses Blast to push her back. He calls this combination of magic Polar Blast, and from there Viera grabs a coat and puts it on. However, that's when Paul shows up and says that he'll handle this on his own. And then immediately after like a couple seconds of Rudius dodging his attacks, Paul gives up and asks help from both Viera and Shara. And now that Rudius isn't distracted anymore, he uses simple stone cannons to knock out both Viera and Shara, and has a short 1v1 with Paul before they find out each other's identity. So the anime and manga don't cover this next part until like next episode, but I'll just go over it quickly now. We get Paul's story ever since the Teleportation Incident. And it starts off with Paul and Norn being transported to the southern part of the central continent, but more specifically, it's kind of near Lilia's hometown, and the town that he learned the Water God style in. And he says that he only stayed in that town for maybe a year or two, and he had left his father's home to get away from being berated and bossed around, but the students at the dojo were all just the same, except they didn't even have the strength to show it. Hell, even the master of the dojo was only an advanced rank water style practitioner. And so once Paul became intermediate ranked, he wanted to ruin something that all of them at the dojo cherished, and so he let out his frustrations on Lilia. He did like her for quite a while, but he never wanted to do something like that. But he did anyway, and he curses himself for his actions of the past. But just then, standing in the middle of just a barren field, Paul noticed that he was holding Norn, and we get a flashback of Zenith telling Paul to hold their daughter, and Paul goes, no. I'm going to be a more dignified parent this time around. I can't show weaknesses. If I play my cards right, she might think I'm the greatest man in the world. And Zenith goes like, isn't that what your father did? I thought you hated him. And then after a moment of silence, Paul's kind of like, Okay, shit, you're right, give me her. And so the two had a nice silly conversation as Lilia was teaching Aisha something or other about cleaning. After Lilia realized that Aisha was like gifted, she started teaching her everything to do with being the perfect maid for the Grey Rats. And that all got Paul thinking about Norn. It's not like she's slow or anything, she's perfectly capable. She's normal. But compared to her two gifted siblings, Paul fears that Norn will grow up in their shadows and feels bad for her. And just then, a blinding light shined through the windows and engulfed them all. Realizing that he's still holding Norn, he knows that this isn't a dream, and he figures that it must have been teleportation magic. He's only experienced it in labyrinths, however. There was one time that he was adventuring with Fangs and accidentally set off a trap. Instinctually, he reacted and grabbed onto Elenalize and teleported her with him. However, teleportation magic can't be produced from a spell. It can only be activated with magic circles and magical items. However, both have been outlawed for hundreds of years and have kind of been lost to time. Paul thinks about why this could have happened to him and remembers that he did have a lot of enemies. Perhaps one of the students back at the dojo is getting revenge for what he did to Lilia back in the day. And so they got him out of the house so they could have their way with Zenith. So Paul realizes that he should get home immediately. But thankfully, Paul always kept a gold Asura coin with him in his sword sheath for emergencies, and he always keeps his sword on him at all times, even when sleeping apparently, but not when making love. Imagine all the people who were just like going at it and then got teleported. That would have been awful. But he also has his adventurer card in its holder too, so he's all set. And he with Norn made his way to the nearest Adventurers Guild and charged his card since it hadn't been used in like years. And he then accepted an E-rank emergency quest, which he could do despite being an S-rank adventurer because it's listed as an emergency. Being an emergency quest, the guild supplies you with a horse that you must return when you're done the quest. However, Paul just wasn't going to do that. He took the horse and rode it all the way back to Fidoa. Riding day and night, Norn fell ill along the way, but by the end he made it in just about 2 months, only to find that it had disappeared. The first words that echoed through his mind were, they were wiped out by a teleportation trap. And as mentioned before, Paul has experience in teleportation traps, and they are the most dangerous trap that can be found inside of a labyrinth. They can split you up from your party and can have you be killed in an instant. And just as he was thinking this, Norn asked him when they'll be home, and it snapped him out of his head. He didn't understand what happened, but Norn wasn't worried because she had Paul with her. He was her father. I mean, he is a father now, so he can't show weakness. No matter what thoughts he had about the status of Zenith, Lilia, or Aisha, if he shows weakness to Norn, that wouldn't be good for either of them. Apparently, since Philip and Soros have been missing, Philip's brother, James, took responsibility for Fidoa, but was receiving lots of pressure and backlash since he'd rather save his own skin than his people. And then Paul ran into Alphonse, who used his own pocket money to set up a refugee camp, and he asked for Paul's help. Thanks to Alphonse's connections, after about a month, they were able to create a successful camp. And from there, Paul created the Fidoa Search and Rescue Squad and traveled all across the central continent in search of victims. After that, the power struggle in the royal capital had resolved itself and Alphonse began to receive disaster recovery funds. Paul then took off with the squad to the holy country of Millis so he could go to the home of the headquarters of the Adventurers Guild. After about 6 months of staying in Millis, he found that many of the Fidoans had been teleported to that continent and Paul went to rescue most of them, although some were sold into slavery, which they had to save them from. And Zenith's family, the Latrias, were quite powerful in Millis and produced many famous knights. Paul went to them for help, and thanks to them, he was able to free many of the slaves. He opted to do things legally and purchase many of the slaves, but when that didn't work, he used the Latrias to put pressure on them. And when that didn't work, he'd result in forcing the slaves into safety by kidnapping them. When he thought if Zenith or Lilia had been put into slavery, nothing would stop him from doing what it takes to set them free. And we then hit a year since the teleportation incident and they started to hear more news about dead Fidoans than found ones. And it was always like that from the start, but the ratio kept getting worse. He, Atos, Chloe, Bonnie, Lane, Mary, and Monty, and even Laws, Sylphie's father, all of them were dead. With each new piece of bad news, members of the squad would cry and Paul's mental health deteriorated. There were plenty of times that they were so close to saving the person, but they were just a tad too late. And then the family would get angry and ask why they weren't there sooner. Paul says that if only he had the fangs of the Black Wolf to help him, he could have them search the demon and Beggared continents, but only one of them showed their faces to him in the past year, Geese. He and Geese spoke a few brief words before Geese left, and it's no wonder he didn't want to stick around. Paul and him had a pretty big fight when he and Zenith left Fangs all those years back. And now it makes sense why Geese didn't want to teach Eris to cook. Obviously he was upset about Paul and Zenith leaving because of him teaching Zenith to cook, but he claims that Paul didn't end up happy. However, that's only because he saw him in the drunken and depressed state since the Fedora teleportation incident. It's not that Zenith didn't make him happy, it's everything else. But now a year and a half has passed since the teleportation incident, and at this point the Fedoan search and rescue was focusing more on the latter half of their name, rescuing people and bringing them back home. By the 2-year mark, the government would cut off their funding. Although it made sense since they'd just be looking in the middle of fields and countrysides, it did feel just a little too soon. And day after nothing but bad news, Paul was literally never sober. Because when he was, he'd imagine his family begging him for help, his family dead on the ground wishing that they had been saved. He never went to the team meetings and barely helped out his squad. He started to think, why is he helping out all these strangers? He could have been spending the past 18 months looking for his family in the Demon and Beggared continent. Alone if he had to. But that's the thing. He wasn't alone. He still had Norn. She was the only family that he had left, and with her being only 4, he couldn't risk her safety. No matter how drunk Paul got, unlike the rest of the squad who began to avoid him, Norn always loved talking with him. Daddy, guess what? Guess what happened when I was outside? Oh, what? Did something good happen? Yeah, I almost fell down the street, but this big bald guy helped me out and he gave me this, look. And Norn presented Paul with a fresh, bright red apple. And just then, someone from Paul's squad ran into him and said that there's an emergency. Their guys who went out for the job today were attacked are in the warehouse just next door. That's when Paul got up and dealt with the troublemaker. And now we are back in the present. Paul was staying in the Dawn's Door Inn but led Rudius next door to a bar. It was filled with Paul's companions, including Viera and Shara, with Viera having taken the coat off and is now back in her bikini armor for some reason. It's one thing to have lightweight armor, many women in this world do because of the healing magic, they can just heal themselves better, but this was like excessive. As she caught Rudius's eye for checking her out, she gave him a little wink, and he returned the gesture. And from there, like word for word, Rudy and Paul's fight went as it did in the manga and anime. There isn't really much to talk about that hasn't been said already. Although when Rudius went back to his inn's room, Ruijerd eventually showed up holding an envelope that he was about to give to Rudius. But after asking what happened, Rudius spilled all the details and he kind of just said, I see, before he left the room. A few hours after that, Eris returned all giddy about her adventure, but when she saw Rudius' face, she bugged Rudius over and over until he told her what happened. And then she said that she'll kill Paul before storming out. And after a moment, she was dragged back in by Ruijerd by the scuff of her neck like a cat and plopped her on the ground. Ruijerd says that she shouldn't interfere in a family's squabble, but Eris spun around and said that there are just some things that you never say to your child, even if you're fighting. And although Ruijerd agrees, he says that he understands Paul's side of things as well. Eris says, okay, but what about how Rudius feels? You know him better than his father. Rudius is the most carefree and confident person in the world. You can punch and kick him and he shrugs it off, but look at him now. And Ruijerd's like, sure, so how about you, as a young woman like yourself, console him about it? And she, again, paces around the room and stuff like she does in the anime before eventually hugging Rudius. And he thinks to himself that he needs to lean on Eris a little bit. At least for now. And so, that was an episode. I'm not gonna lie, as I was reading the stuff with Norn, I don't know why, Norn, like, she's such a sad character. I was like on the verge of tearing up sometimes just reading all of that. I don't know why, but Norn stuff just hits me in the feels, and so I'm not ready to cover like her future events. God. But anyway, that was the most heavy episode in Mushoku Tensei, but I can guarantee you there will be at least one episode coming up soon that will trump that easily. And so I can't wait to eventually cover that one. I'm not ready for that one. Oh god, there's a lot of episodes in the future that I'm not ready to cover. Alright, so if you enjoyed this video for whatever reason, this was sad, you shouldn't have liked it. You should be crying. Give it a like though, give it a like, you should do that. Even though you're sad while listening to this, probably, don't dislike. If you are feeling sadness, that means that it's affecting you and it's hitting you hard and good. And so you got to give that a like. And so you also have to subscribe, hit that bell notification button for the bells of the notification